Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. When listening here at Grief Refuge, we make time to hold space for grief, authentic grief, grief that hurts and grief that heals. This podcast is very unique. It isn't your typical talk about grief podcast. It's more of a what to do with grief podcast. Here, you're able to be with your grief feelings. Grief Refuge is about being in your heart and feeling it to heal it. I'm truly honored you're here, and let's begin. Today I'm changing things up. I normally don't like to interview people because I feel like there's this formality to it that we're supposed to be professional and share something so deep and personal. It just doesn't feel authentic enough for me. So I reached out to our guest, Benjamin Allen, and I just said, hey, can I interview you on our podcast? I didn't really give him anything to talk about. Benjamin has quite a story. It's a tragic story. And I wanted to interview him because knowing a bit about his story, I just thought, wow, this man's been through the ringer, and yet here he is, speaking about healing. So you won't hear it from Benjamin, but within 13 years, he lost 2 sons and his wife. After feeling like he had nothing but grief, he made a choice. He made a hard choice. He decided to lean into his grief, and he decided to go in as far as it would take him. What does that mean? Fortunately, there's a lot of depth to Benjamin's answer, and he explains it here to follow. I've titled this episode Coming to Peace with the Pain of Loss and Grief. I hope you enjoy this conversation. It literally is 2 strangers who got together, talked about their grief with no agenda, and this is the result. Enjoy.
After my family died over a 13-year period, one after another, I went off to Mendocino, where the beach to be by the ocean. I know that's what you described as a very healing place for you, and I did the same thing. I went to the ocean. That's where I spread their ashes, was down in the Bay Area, and so I wanted to be close to the ocean in that sense. Uh, and so I just walked the cliffs, and I had nothing left. I had quit my job at the medical school, which I was working with people that were dying. I was working with families, caregivers, and so forth. And after Matt, the last to die, at the age of 13, I said, I'm out of here. And I wasn't a father anymore. I wasn't a husband anymore. I wasn't an employee anymore. I had nothing left but my grief. And I decided that I was going to lean into this grief as far as it was going to take me. And so I was going to lean into it and just see whatever emotion showed up, whatever experience I had. And I started thinking, well, most belief systems talk about life beyond this point, and I'm of the belief that there is a transcendence to this life, and so there's an afterlife in some way, shape, or form. And I was going, well, there's no life of before. There's no way I'm going to go back. There's no going back. So where am I? And I said, well, I'm living in the afterloss. And what I found was, and what I share with people that I work with, is that when people go through great grief, that there's this subterranean world of this afterloss, and it's out of sync with the surface world. And that's what happens to us when we go the initial stages of great grief. What I found, I'll speak for myself, even though so for those that may be listening, is that time was different, energy was different, everything was so surreal, and it's like this going into a Salvador Dali landscape because this afterloss and going through that. And as I was doing that in Mendocino, And I dealt with grief. In 1986, our youngest son died at 8.5 months old, and I dealt with grief there. And then about 3.5 years later, my wife died, and then about 2 years, 3 years later, Matt died. So this piling on of grief, and there's one thing that I always share with is that grief doesn't live in isolation, and one loss brings up all losses, because it's not just the loss itself, but how we deal with loss itself and our belief system around that and how we engage with loss. And so I went off to Mendocino and I walked the cliffs and I said, I'm just going to ride this out and see where it takes me. A friend came over and he was saying, that he said, Benjamin, we're all worried about you. He says, what do you do all day? And I said, I don't know, but it takes me all day to do it. Because it was just this whole thing of my life turned into inches and centimeters. And I used to have to pull myself out of bed and push myself out the door because it was just so immobilizing. And it was absolutely excruciating. I dealt with their terminal illnesses for 13 years and cared for them for 13 years. And I thought that was going to be the hardest part. But the hardest part was after the deaths. After Matt died, Matt and I we were incredibly close. And it just ripped me to shreds. And this fragmentation, the image that I had early in the whole unfolding of our experience was that it was like having an earthquake and then walking through the ruins of my house and picking up little fragments saying, this I can still use. This has been destroyed. This is no longer use to me. It's sifting through life and finding out what's left. And that's what I encountered for that 13-year period. But after Matt died and I went to Mendocino, it was just on steroids. It was just massive. And it was like tsunamis would be, waves of these emotions would come. And I had a friend at that time. I met her there. She had remarried, but I didn't know her before this. But there's a phrase that I like. A proverb says, "Deep calls to deep," and those of us that have gone through deep experiences, we find each other. And what I found her, and she had earlier in her life, she had a stepson die in a motorcycle accident at the age of 17. A year later, her biological daughter, died of leukemia. And then a couple of years after that, her husband was murdered. And she had gone through this tremendous grief. And she kind of nurtured me through these initial stages. And she said something very powerful. She said, whatever you do, don't let your heart close. Keep your finger in your heart and never let it close. And when I was going through these tsunamis of pain, I would be just in a fetal position crying, and they would like waves that would come out of nowhere. This was right after Matt died and I moved to the city. And I would just write it out and I would just keep my finger in my heart and not let it close. And what I found after that, after each wave, my heart expanded. That there was more compassion, there was more care, there was more connection to life. When we go through great loss, it is actually has the potential for being an entryway into great life and great love. And that's the one thing about grief. As I was walking these cliffs, there's a lot of things that I share with these folks that I work with, is that grief isn't linear. It isn't something you get over. There isn't a shelf life to grief. Our society does such a poor job with how to handle someone with loss. It's about being comfortable with our own set of losses so we can sit for those that are lost. I often say that for those that have never experienced great loss, they don't know what to say. And for those that have experienced great loss, they know there's nothing that can be said. It's sitting in that silence, it's sitting in that space. And what what I encourage people to do is to sit with another with presence and authenticity. You don't have to fix anyone. In fact, I never take anybody's pain away or diminish it in any way. And so it's about holding space and being with someone. But back to this whole thing around the how grief works is that for me, healing is not the absence of pain when it comes to grief, when it comes to this great loss. Healing is coming to peace with the pain. I will always love my family. I will miss them every day till the day I die. I will be connected to them every day till the day I die. And yet I have peace within that pain. And oftentimes we confuse the pain of loss with physical pain. Physical pain we want to get rid of. We'll take a pill, we'll do this, we'll exercise, we'll whatever we can to get rid of that physical pain. But in loss, to do that is diminish. There's such a interesting dance that happens is that I've seen so many people go through loss and they feel like if they don't stay in pain, they're portraying the ones they love. And that's not true. What I find and what I help people do is to come to a place of peace, and that pain changes. It evolves and it metamorphoses into something else, but it's there. It's not going to go away, but it shifts and it changes. So this whole thing of this after loss and who am I? What I found is for me, grief is more of a reintegration to life than getting back into something. And what I feel is there's a reintegration process that goes on within us as individuals. It's not the same. And I can go into what the whole esoteric kind of existential experience that I have with that on an individual basis, but there's that arena, and then there's the arena of the different relationship with the one we've lost. That doesn't end. I grieve not a 13-year-old. I grieve a 38-year-old that I'm not going to ever see. I grieve not being a grandparent. I grieve at all the stages of life. I grieve, what would he be doing now? What if I could just pick up the phone and hear his voice? So that's what I grieve now. And that's the relationship as it evolves. It doesn't end. It evolves into something else. And I help people find how that works for them and they're within their belief system, not mine, theirs. And then there's the reintegration into the world around us. It's not the same world. And, this world of the after loss and the world of the surface, what I try to do with folks is to find a way to weave them together to where one does not negate the other, but honors each of those. So it's about getting into life, having a more expansive life, but also honoring the journey that someone has been on. It's not a betrayal to continue life. In fact, it is actually a testament to that love to continue life. And the only way that I've ever experienced someone that doesn't grieve in a healthy way, and I can describe healthy ways, but the only way is when they are frozen and when at the point of death, when they can't leave that point. And stagnation is the only way I've seen that's been detrimental. Any type of fluidity, the anger, the fear, the frustration, the joy, the happiness, the gratitude, all these, if they stay in a fluid state, they go in and find their way into healing, like rivers. All these emotions that I went through in Mendocino, I would watch them and I would track them and I would just lean into it, whatever it was, whether it was that tsunami, whether it was this emptiness, whether it was fear, anger. worked through the anger a long time before Matt had died, although I had massive amounts, but I kept it fluid and it found its way. But all those rivers end up in the ocean of healing. And so that's what I encourage people to do, and talk about things to say to people, not to say to people. When I work with the professionals, one of the most important things to say is, don't ever say to someone, I know how you feel. I said, do not say that, because even if someone had the same experience as me, a wife that died, two children died over 13, if it was the exact same, I would never know how they felt. And we don't. Grief is lived out on there are universal principles that are lived out in unique individual ways, and nobody can really know what another is feeling and experiencing. And so what I say to them is to say, I have no idea how you feel, but I'm here for you if you want to reach out. There's no way I could ever comprehend how you feel right now, but I'm here for you.
It's a very empathetic approach. I can see that being very supportive to people who are really struggling with their emotions. One of the things you mentioned earlier that actually really surprised me, I've never thought about this before. You were talking about grieving your son, and how in the now, when you connect with your son, you grieve him as a 38-year-old male. And I was like, oh, wow, how interesting. But what I wanted to ask was, like, in regards to that experience, because I'm going to assume it's very common. I'm going to assume that most of us have that, because when you were sharing that, I was even thinking about this past April would have been my father's 70th birthday. And there was just something that really stuck out for that. And I was like, gosh, there's so much of his life that, was just taken away. And here we are trying to make sense of it all. And there was something that really gravitated towards me, the way you said what you said in regards to the grief process continuing in the moment, being more at peace with it. And I had this thought of, like, you do a good job for making choices in the moment. And I was wondering if you could just kind of share a little bit more about how you make these choices. Do you run through some kind of system in your mind, or do you have a strategy that you follow?
In the choices, and what, give me an example of what you mean by choices.
Similar to your son, when you say, okay, now if I have moments of thinking about my son, I think about what I'm missing as a 38-year-old. So if that brings up a type of emotional experience, is there a process you follow to manage the emotions?
What I do, and I did this from the very beginning, is in that leaning into whatever shows up, then and not resisting it. My pain comes from resistance. So I just lean into it. If it's a joyful moment, a happy memory, or if it's a painful memory, I sit with it and say it's okay. I don't define, for instance, his birthday was in October, and October 4th. And October 4th is really hard for me because that's when Lydia got the transfusion 10 hours before he was born with the HIV in it. And that's what took her life, took Matt's life, and took his little brother's life, our youngest son's life. So it was the greatest day of my life, but it was the day they were all infected, and that the loss started to happen. And so what I do on anniversaries of deaths and on birthdays a lot, that has evolved. I don't do it as frequently as I did before, but this was really helpful for me and on anniversaries or great times of connection. We actually started this when Brian died at 8.5 months old, and Matt was around two, a little over 2 years old, and so he never got to his first birthday, Brian. And unfortunately, Brian's birthday was on Mother's Day. How cruel can that be? You know, his first birthday they didn't arrive at. So we that one we actually planted a tree in his honor. What we wanted Matt to know is Brian would never be forgotten, and because we most parents get to teach their children how to live, I had to teach my son how to die, and this whole realm of not being forgotten, Brian. So we had these anniversaries, and we would have a celebration, and that evolved into something that was first we had balloons, and we'd let off balloons, and it was so funny because Matt, being a 4-year-old, thought that was environmentally incorrect, and so he didn't want to do that anymore. So what we came up with, and what actually I came up with, was a rose ceremony, and I've done this for all these years. As I take a rose and I go to a body of water, because I spread their ashes in the like I said, in the bay, in San Francisco Bay, and actually it was Half Moon Bay, but the so I go to a body of water, and I like creeks a lot, but I'll take a petal off, and I'll think about a beautiful memory, and this beautiful memory, and after it's kind of simmered and marinated into my life, I would kiss the petal, and I would drop it in the water and go thank you, and I would go through memory after memory with each petal, and it was an honoring of their life, an honoring what they gave me in my life, the gift of life, and the beauty that they gave me, and everyone would be thank you at the end, thank you, and then I would always get a rose. I always do get a rose with thorns in it, because then at the end I would kiss the thorns and I would drop it into the water. So that's that kind of honoring. That's that the choices we make is that there is this. It's not a conscious thing. It's more of how my belief system works, how gratitude works, how sorrow works in my life, how the expansion of life is. So it's leaning into it. What we try to do, we think, oh, it's for instance, this last one was excruciating for me for some reason. I don't know why, as opposed to other years. And at first I thought, well, I should be over that. I mean, it's been a long time. It's been over 20 some years. But then I realized, no, it's not. I'm living off somebody else's belief system. That's bullshit. You know, the reality is this is what it feels right now. And I don't judge my feelings. I don't judge right or wrong. I just say this is what it is. And this, it hurts today. And so as I do that, the fluidity happens, and I always come to healing. Now, I also, when I work with individuals greatly, one of the things I always say is you do not have to worry about the overwhelm and the overload. In our spirits, in our being, there's a shut-off valve. We've had enough. And so many times I've come up to that shut-off valve. I can't take any more. I can't take any more of this pain. And it said shuts off. And I get back into breath. I get back into a rhythm. And then it may circle around. It may come around. And grief is not about, it's not linear. What it is expansive. And I look at it as going deeper and deeper. Is that the tears that came this last October were deep tears, and they were beautiful tears. You know that it's about going deeper into life, and deeper into love, and deeper into compassion. That's what grief gives us, is the depths of life.
That's pretty profound. I almost want to say nothing. hard hard to do that on something that's an audio program.
Yeah. Yeah, nodding your head doesn't work very well on audio.
Right. we'll just sit in silence and nod our heads, and
Yeah.
everybody listening will wonder what's going
Yeah.
on. did
Is there?
I lose? Did I lose the file? Did I lose something?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing more about that. Here's a funny coincidence. At the time that my dad died, I was in graduate school in Palo Alto. When we got the news, I was there. I grew up in the Twin Cities, and so when he died in Minneapolis, and I had a couple days before I was gonna catch the flight back to Twin Cities, and my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, said, "Would you like to do something?" And I said, "How about this? Let's go to the ocean and do a ceremony." And here's the coincidence, Benjamin. We brought one red rose, and
Nice.
we went to Half Moon Bay,
Oh my God.
and
That's great.
I did not follow a similar ceremony to your beautiful one, but what I did was that we noticed the tide was coming in, and so I kind of planted the rose at the edge of the shoreline, and we just sat in silence and had an emotional experience and watched the tide come in and eventually wash away the rose. And
Wow. Beautiful.
yeah, and so thank you for such a sharing such a blessed ceremony for your experience. And I just had to share my own because I'm like, it's not such a coincidence. There's definitely something on a deeper level of having some similarities for ceremonies of honoring loved ones, and
It's
in some ways saying hello and saying goodbye at the same time.
it's very important to have ritual. There needs to be an outward expression of that internal journey. And I strongly encourage that for people, everyone, to find their own ritual. I mean, many people go to the graveside, uh, but that's so needed to touch those places with an external act, because that really does align the internal. Yeah, it's
Yeah, absolutely.
wow, small world.
Very small world. There's a part of me that just wishes so many more people in our country and worldwide would have opportunities to engage in some of their own grieving process along coasts or around along salt water and being on beaches and oceans. You mentioned earlier some of the things about like perhaps getting stuck, someone in grief getting stuck, or having a flow. I can't remember your exact words, but it actually made me think of the ocean because the ocean is always in constant flow or constant movement. And you mentioned you enjoy streams. Well, pretty much streams are always flowing. Yeah, so there's always the energy of a continuation. As esoteric as it may sound, I know that that's been very substantial in my healing process, in making meaning for my losses, or me questioning my purpose. Now that there's no father figure in my life or something.
Right.
Yeah, it's so profound, being near moving water.
Well,
Yeah, and
fluidity is absolutely essential, emotionally, mentally, everything is emotion. And what happens to people that are in that, because our society doesn't deal with grief well, this is one of my biggest concerns, because what they want it to be over with. When are you going to get back to normal? When are you going to get back to work? When are you going to do this? And there is no going back. And we don't. And what happens to people when they're in this artificial paradigm of I've got to get back, and they know they can't, and there starts to be a sense of guilt. There starts to be a sense of what's wrong with me, and all of this kind of mentality. And then what happens? People need to talk about this. And like I shared what was going on with me, and it brought you into sharing what your journey has been. That's normal. That's common. That's healthy. What's unhealthy is when people want to share stories, and people, the world around them is saying, "Oh no, not again." And how you doing? Well, I'm in pain. Oh, not again. And so what happens to people that really concerns me is they go into this in this landscape of the after loss, and they submerge in it, and they live with secret sorrow. They live in isolation. Grief in and of itself is isolation and separation. And what needs to happen is for people have the ability to connect. And that's why there's so many Facebook groups and so many things, is that hunger to connect and to be known and to be heard and to hear another and to know they're not alone. That's one of the most essential elements of working through grief, is you are not alone. Yeah, nobody can know exactly what you're going through, but we know that you need to know you're not alone as you journey through this. So the secret sorrow, and then people start going on with their lives, and it's so out of sync, and they start hiding their sorrow, and they start trying to get back into the world around them, and it doesn't fit. And that's why I use the whole paradigm about the reintegration. It's not fitting into a world of before. It's not fitting into somebody else's identity. You're a different person. You have changed. When loss happens, loss in and of itself is change. It could be loss of a divorce. It can be, as I work with professionals, it can be loss in divorce. It can be loss of a job. It could be loss of money. It could be loss. Loss is loss. And every loss is an element of change. And this great loss of great grief of losing someone we deeply love, that's the ultimate loss. But it does not negate all the other losses. When I work with the wealth managers, I tell them, when you do an assessment to a new client, don't say, what are your losses, but say, what are the challenges you've gone through? And they will pinpoint all the losses that they've had, because those are our greatest challenges. Is that, oh, my mom died when I was 6 years old, or we moved 8 times, or during the Depression, my father lost everything. You can track someone's life and how they engage with life by how they engage with their loss. And people don't realize that the magnitude. My whole trajectory of life was altered, immeasurably and eternally altered by my losses. I am not in the same place, the same path, the same, any of that. That has changed. Loss is change. And so how do we address that? And how do we honor someone that's going through that change? And so we really screw up the way we deal with loss and grief in this society.
Yeah, I was kind of heading in that direction of asking you if, as we've had this nice conversation, there's been, I feel like a lot of wisdom shared from you. Thank you for that. And I was like, in my work in bereavement support or grief support, I do, and I feel like this will sound like a judgment, but it's not my intention. I do recognize that people do get stuck in their bereavement, in their grief, and it's a very difficult, for lack of a better word, place for them. And I was wondering if there is any sage wisdom you might have for recognizing that stuck energy.
Well, yeah, there's that they may be in a spin cycle, but if it stays fluid, they'll spin out of it. They'll find an exit point. So there may be the same stories, or maybe this. I worked with one person when I was very young. I had not gone through all these losses. And I would go to her house. She was an elderly woman, and her son had died 30, 40 years earlier. And his room was the same, pictures of him. She never left the apartment. That was the ultimate of stagnation. And so she was just not going to leave that. And there's a couple of reasons why people can become stagnant. there's more than that, but a couple that come to mind are, one is that they will feel they're betraying the one they love if they go on with life. And that is not true. And I'll give you a story. I'll say the other one, but then I'll come back because I'll forget it if I don't. The other one is the betrayal. And the other one is that people are not given permission to speak and to live their grief. So they hide it and it becomes encased because they become separate from the world. And that's all they have. In separation, there's no way to get back into the rhythm of life when you're separate in this whole massive experience and world and entity, and trying to connect to the world around you, and you're carrying this massive weight day in and day out. And so what's easier is to stop and hold that weight. And so if there is fluidity, if there's a way to let people grieve without judgment on how they're grieving, that can create the fluidity and help alleviate the stagnation. But the first one about the betrayal, a beautiful story is that when my wife was dying, Lydia, a couple of weeks before she died, we were having a chat. She says, "I hope you find someone else. I hope you find love again." Says, because if you find love again, what that will tell us, that will say is that our love was special enough that you wanted to have it again. And I've been married for 20 years now to Rachel. And Rachel, every ounce of love that I have for Rachel is a testament to my love for Lydia. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And so, and the honoring of loving Rachel is the honoring of loving Lydia. And the honoring of loving Lydia is the honoring of loving Rachel. And so that's a very good example of moving on, but not moving away. And that's what people are afraid of. If I become happy again, I've worked with people that have been very uncomfortable when the pain stopped, very uncomfortable when they were attracted to someone else, or very uncomfortable when they laughed again, so that they were betraying the ones that they had lost. And that's not. To live life to its fullest is the greatest testament someone can give to the loss they've experienced and the ones they've lost.
It's super beautiful, and it's such a helpful perspective. I feel like more and more wisdom keeps getting shared. I'm really just at a loss for words, of course, when words are needed most. But I guess that's common when, discussing and sharing grief stories.
Yeah.
I feel like oftentimes saying less is one of the gifts that one can bring to anyone supporting another in grief. Saying less and listening more. Gosh, there's a lot to really ruminate on. There's a lot to really hold from this conversation. I think we might have to end there, Benjamin. I think that might be where we say, man, thank you so much gratitude for a beautiful discussion.
Well, thank you.
And quite transparently, for two strangers.
Yeah.
For two strangers who've barely ever spoken before, but just had some emails, and here we are.
What connected us,
process.
Reed, was when before we started, a little about my story. I didn't know anything about yours. But when I said, what losses have you gone through that drawn you into this field? And you shared about the couple of losses that you've had, that connects. That's where we're connecting now. It's not on a podcast. It's not on what we say. It's the spirit in which we connect, and that deep calls to deep. That's what happens for people. That's the hunger that people have, is to connect. And what you're providing for them is another chance to know they're not alone. And I know I'm not alone with you, and you know you're not alone when we talk with me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really nice thing to say too, especially for I think when we get emotional, there's some Midwestern guilt inside of me that is kind of cultural, where it's like it's not okay to express this, and part of the reason why is because I'm not confident people will understand it. That is definitely part of my personality, but I will also say there's some cultural norm in that too, especially with, how I've witnessed and observed a lot of people from the area I grew up in handle their grief or totally try to dismiss it. And so just move on,
Yeah.
life goes on.
That happens for people, and I never try to get them emotional, or I honor where they're at because that's how they choose to grieve. And every choice has its consequences, and that we we grieve the way we live,
Mhm.
and our culture defines a lot how we live. So I honor everyone's journey on what they do. But so that I've dealt with that Midwestern kind of buck up and let's go on.
Right.
That's fine.
Hold it all in.
Yeah, I know I couldn't do it. I wouldn't want to do it, but there are people that's okay. I'll
Yeah.
say one last thing. When this person I was working with, he said his daughter died at 18, about 10 years earlier, and he said that to me off the cuff. He said, "I haven't put up the gravestone because if I did, that would mean it's completely over." And then he said, "That's probably wrong." And I stopped him right there. I said, "No, that's not wrong. That's what you need to do. It's okay. It's okay to grieve how you need to grieve." And that's what people need to hear. If they want to be stoic, that's okay. If they want to share, that's okay. But to shame someone for how they hurt is horrendous. It's a tragedy. And there's so much shame that comes with grief. But we could go on with guilt and shame and all that kind of stuff forever and a day. But it's okay to grieve the way you want to grieve.
Well, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I don't know about you, but I greatly enjoyed the gentleness and the peacefulness to Benjamin's presence. I liked hearing his laugh, and I liked just listening to his soul speak. Benjamin doesn't live in his head. He's got a different purpose, and it's a heart-opening purpose. I found a sense of wisdom that one can gain from grief, and Benjamin sure shared a lot of wisdom in this conversation. Pieces of sorrow, pieces of gratitude, compassion, anger. There's a lot that we can learn from this. As we walk our own paths on our grief journey, I keep coming back to the word honoring. And it was really nice to hear Benjamin speak to honoring our feelings when we're grieving. Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you to you. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I hope this conversation has helped in your healing process. If you found this helpful, I ask of you to please share the recording. There's a lot of grief in our world right now, and healing conversations can do so much. If you're tech savvy, please rate and review. Let me know how this podcast is working for you. And if you need further support, please contact me at griefrefuge.com. Thank you, take care, keep honoring your grief, be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.